Every funeral runs on one rule, and it is written nowhere. Nothing interrupts a goodbye. Not a twisted strap, not a wet step, not a red light. Each of these cases holds a moment when one sentence would have been enough, and the silence won, based on real events, dramatized, with names and places changed. None of it is guidance, and none of it should ever be repeated. 1. The only man who knew what was inside the north wall drove home at 4:10 and thought no more about it. He had spent that afternoon cutting a grave at Fairlane Memorial Grounds in western Pennsylvania for a service set for the following morning. It was the 10th of April, 2011. Halfway down the north wall, his bucket had opened a pale band of sand, about a foot thick, running through the clay and damp from the water table. He noticed it the way a man notices anything he has seen 100 times before. He squared the corners by hand, laid the cover sheet over the hole, and clocked out. There was nowhere for what he had seen to go. Fairlane kept a daily log with a column for the plot number and a column for the word finished, and he filled in both. The crew that would stand at that grave in the morning was a different crew. No procedure at Fairlane had ever required the two crews to speak. Rain started around 9 that night and did not stop until 3. Just over an inch fell, ran off the cover sheet, and soaked the ground on both sides of the hole. What that rain changed takes a moment to lay out, and it is the whole case. Dry soil holds a vertical face through friction between its grains. Water works in between the grains, and the friction goes. What remains is a wall standing on nothing except the fact that it has not moved yet. Clay with a wet band of sand inside it does not crumble in warning handfuls. It lets go all at once, along the band, in a single piece. A trench cut to that depth on a building site would be shored with steel or timber. The standard is written down. What a building site also has is an inspector who might arrive and a shoring frame already lying in the yard. A cemetery has neither. One more thing matters. Earth coming down on a standing man rarely kills him by impact. A cubic yard of wet clay weighs about as much as a small car, and once it packs around the chest, the ribs can no longer rise. The airway stays clear. He can talk, answer questions, and ask for help. None of that changes the fact that his chest cannot lift what is sitting on it. Everyone digging toward him is working against a clock of a few minutes. The morning crew clocked in at 7. None of them had been on the grounds the day before. The service began at 10, with about 60 people at the graveside. The casket went onto the lowering frame and the belts began to pay out. Then they stopped because one belt had twisted under the box and was riding off its roller. The correct fix was to raise the casket, halt the service, and reset the frame in front of the family. That takes about 15 minutes. The other fix was one man in the grave for under a minute, reaching up to flip the belt flat. A groundskeeper from the morning crew went down the ladder. He was 34 years old. He was standing beside the casket with one hand on the belt when the north wall came away. It came off in a single piece, from the sand band down, a slab the size of a door. There was very little noise. People at the back of the crowd did not understand. Anything had happened until they saw the family move. The groundskeeper was buried to the collarbone, facing the wall, both arms pinned under the earth. A second man was in the grave within a minute, pulling at the fill with his hands. Shovels are useless that close to a head. Then the rest of the north wall came in and took the second man to the waist. 2 more men got him out under the arms. Mourners in funeral clothes knelt at the edge and dug with their hands in a line, passing earth back between them. The groundskeeper answered them for the first part of it. He said his chest hurt. He asked them to free his arms first. Somewhere in the 4th or 5th minute he stopped answering. Recovering him took 40 minutes. The coroner recorded that he had been conscious when the earth reached him and that he was gone before the second fall came in. 2 things would have stopped this, and neither of them was the latter. The first was one sentence. There is sand in the north wall. That sentence existed in one man's head at 4 in the afternoon, and had nowhere to go. Fairlane had no handover form, no radio call, no second signature, nothing built to carry a warning across a night and 2 crews. The second was 15 minutes. A family stands in the sun while 3 men reset a frame. That is the delay every person at a graveside feels responsible for preventing. It is also the delay nobody at a graveside is willing to cause. The company that owned Fairlane bought 2 aluminum shoring frames the following spring. It also wrote 3 rules. Nobody enters an open grave after measurable rain. Any grave opened by one crew and used by another is walked by both crews together before the service. Belts are checked with the casket on the ground and never over the hole. The daily log has 3 columns now. The third one is for whatever the digger noticed. 2. The 6 of them had the casket up 4 steps before anyone felt it change. It was raining that morning in a river town in eastern Missouri on the 22nd of October, 1996. It had been raining since before first light. The church was 90 years old. Its front steps were limestone, 11 of them, worn into shallow dishes in the middle by a century of feet. Wet limestone, polished by use, behaves about like soap. Everyone in that town had slipped on those steps at some point and laughed about it. What made that morning different was the load. A hardwood casket with a sealed lid weighs roughly what a full refrigerator weighs, and that is before anyone is inside it. 6 men manage it easily on flat ground. On a staircase, the weight stops being shared. The men in front stand lower than the men behind, so the box tilts and the load slides back onto the 2 rear corners. If a front bearer drops even a few inches, the men at the back are suddenly holding most of it. They get no warning. Their feet are wherever their feet happen to be, and they cannot look down to check because the box is in the way. And a pallbearer does not let go. Nobody is ever taught that. It is simply what a man does when he is carrying someone he knew. The woman in the casket was 81. She had been married in that church, and her husband had been carried up those same steps in 1971. About 90 people were already inside, and the organ had started. Outside, there was rain on the hearse roof and nothing else. It had eased to a drizzle by then, which is part of why nobody was thinking about the stone. The steps themselves had already been wet for 5 hours. That morning, the funeral director had mentioned the side door off the parking lot, which sits at street level and has no steps at all. He mentioned it once, quietly, in the way funeral directors mention things. The family said, the front. All 6 bearers were family, chosen the way families choose. One was 73. One was 4 months out of shoulder surgery. Ordinarily, 2 of the 6 would have been the funeral home's own men. Those men do this several times a week. They know to stop at the bottom, set their feet, and start the climb together on a count. Nobody offered them that morning, and nobody asked. The 6 came off the sidewalk out of step and never got back into it. Carl Hoyt had the rear right corner. His cousin had the rear left, close enough to feel every shift through the handle. On the 5th step, the front right bearer put his shoe into one of the worn dishes. His knee went down, and his corner dropped about 8 inches. The box swung right and back. Everything that had been spread across 6 men arrived at one man's hands. Hoyt stepped backward to get under it, which is what anyone does. There was no tread behind him. He went over backward with both hands still on the casket handle, and he did not put an arm out. The back of his head met the stone edge 2 steps down. Loss of consciousness was immediate. The other 5 got the box onto the landing without dropping it, because that is also what people do. It sat up there for the better part of an hour. Inside, the organ kept going for some time, because nobody thought to go in and stop it. His wife was in the 2nd pew, and someone had to walk up the aisle and bring her out through the crowd. He was pronounced at the foot of the steps, in the rain, under an umbrella held by a man he had known since grade school. The funeral home changed nothing about its equipment afterward, because none of its equipment had been involved. The place where this could have gone another way was not on the staircase. It was in the parking lot 20 minutes earlier when a level door was mentioned and let go. The director had no authority to insist, and he knew it. Nobody in that situation has authority. A funeral home that overrules a grieving family about how their mother enters a church loses that family. It loses every family they talk to for a generation. So the people with the knowledge had no standing, and the people with the standing had no knowledge. There is no procedure written anywhere that closes that gap, because the thing that needs closing is not a procedure. The second funeral was 9 days later. The 4 remaining bearers carried him in through the side door, on the flat, with 2 men from the funeral home making up the numbers. The cousin who slipped was not one of them. He asked to be left out, and the family let him. Within the year, he moved to another county and stopped coming back for holidays. Hoyt's widow wrote to him twice. The first letter told him she did not blame him. The second, sent a long time afterward, asked him to come to dinner. He answered that one after 11 months, and only to say that he had read the first one many times.
3.
For 11 days, the only person in that city blamed for the crash was the one driver who had done nothing wrong. About 2/3 of the states grant a funeral procession a right-of-way at intersections. The privilege is conditional. The lead car must enter the intersection lawfully, and the cars behind must stay closed up with their headlights on. A car that falls out of the line and stops at a red light has spent that privilege. When it moves again, it is one more vehicle at a signal, and the law treats it as nothing else. The custom is far older than the statutes and far stronger. Drivers who have never read a line of traffic code know to follow the car in front through a light. Drivers waiting at the cross street know to sit still and let the whole thing pass. It works because both halves are performed at the same moment by strangers. It fails when one person at that intersection is not part of it, or believes his part of it is over. The second thing worth knowing is where a person sits inside a car. Facing forward, there is an engine and a structure built to fold. Facing sideways, there is a door, and a door is about as thick as a hardcover book stood on its end. Whatever a side impact is going to do happens inside that distance. On the 8th of June, 2009, 22 cars left a chapel on the north side of a mid-sized Kansas city. The cemetery was 2 miles away, across a 6-lane arterial with a signal. Every car had its headlights on and a small orange flag clipped to the hood. A line that long stretches as it moves, and the gaps open toward the back of it no matter what anyone does. At the light, before the arterial, the last car had fallen half a block behind the one ahead. It caught the red alone. The driver was the nephew of the woman being buried, and her sister sat beside him in the passenger seat. He stopped, watched the tail of the procession pull away, and spent the whole red light losing it. When his light turned green, he put his foot down to close the gap. Dale Ruskin had been waiting at the arterial in a plumbing supply van through most of that same cycle. His light was green. He sat through it while the procession crossed in front of him, because that is what people do, and he watched the whole line go by. Then the road in front of him was empty for several seconds. He put the van in gear. The nephew, arriving at speed, had his foot down for exactly the same reason Ruskin had his foot off the brake. Neither man had any information the other one lacked. They drew opposite conclusions from the same empty road. The front of the van struck the passenger door and carried the car sideways into the far curb. Both vehicles stayed upright. The procession ahead did not stop. The cars in front could not see behind them. The lead car reached the cemetery gate before anyone in it understood why nobody was following. The sister of the deceased was taken out of the car with chest injuries and internal bleeding. She never regained consciousness. She lay in a hospital 11 miles from the cemetery gate her sister's procession had been driving toward. She died on the 11th day. What happened in that city in the meantime is the part worth following. The officer at the scene cited the last car in the procession because the last car had run the light. That citation was a piece of paper in a file. What traveled through the city was a sentence with a different shape. A man in a van drove into a funeral. Within a week, someone put a brick through the van's windshield in the lot behind the supply company. 2 contractors closed their accounts. Ruskin stopped attending his own church, which stood 3 blocks from the chapel, and did his shopping in the next town over. He had never been charged with anything. In that state, a crash with injuries is measured by a patrol officer with a tape and a diagram. A crash with a death goes to a reconstruction unit. So the file was reopened on the 12th day, and a team went out with equipment that had never been near the earlier version of the case. They pulled the timing log from the signal controller. The light had been red for more than 4 seconds when the last car entered the intersection. Ruskin's van had entered on green at 31 miles an hour, under the posted limit. The measurements that cleared his name were taken only because a woman died. Had she lived, the case would have closed with the citation, and nothing would ever have been established at all. The county attorney declined to bring charges against Ruskin and declined to bring them against the nephew as well, at the written request of the family. The nephew kept his citation and paid the fine. A civil action was filed the following year, and it named neither driver. It named the funeral home. The argument was that the company had sent an unescorted line of cars through signaled intersections and left every driver in it to guess. The case settled with no admission of fault, and the terms were sealed. Ruskin's name appears nowhere in the conclusions of the reconstruction report. By the time that report was written, the name had already been everywhere else. 4. In October of 2004, a crew in upstate New York laid 206 headstones flat on the ground. The place is called Kingsley Rural Cemetery, and the stones are still lying there today. Nobody had given permission for it. There was nobody left alive to give it. The reason begins on a Saturday morning the previous September, in the oldest section of the grounds. 5 people stood there for the burial of an urn. The man in the urn had been 88, the last of his generation, which is why the gathering was small. His plot lay in the section his family had bought when the cemetery was young. The old section runs across a slope, and the paths through it are gravel. The grass between the rows had been cut short 2 days earlier, and was still wet. The stones around them were tall, marble and granite, set a century and a half ago. One of the 5 was Marjorie Voss, a cousin of the dead man, 63 years old. What she did not know about those stones, almost nobody knows. Monuments in the oldest parts of American cemeteries are usually not fastened to anything. A tall stone stands on a base, the base stands on the ground, and nothing holds the two together except weight. That was a deliberate choice, not a shortcut. Mortar cracks. A cracked joint holds water against the stone, and water that freezes inside marble splits it from within. 19th century monument men set their work dry on purpose and trusted mass to carry it. That works for as long as the ground underneath stays where it is. Ground in a cold climate does not stay where it is. Water in soil expands when it freezes, and the surface lifts. When it thaws, the surface settles back, but never onto exactly the same place. One winter shifts a heavy stone by a fraction of a millimeter. 130 winters shift it by inches, and never in a straight line. The stone stands upright through all of it, and looks as permanent as the day it was set. It goes over at the moment its weight is no longer above its base, and by then it needs almost nothing. Marjorie Voss stepped off the path to let the others move past her. Her shoe went out from under her on the wet grass. She reached for the nearest thing standing, which was a marble stone about the height of a man, set on a base the size of a footstool. She put roughly half her weight on it for less than a second. The stone came off the base without turning over. More than a ton of marble landed across her legs. Nobody there could move it, and the 4 of them stayed with her until a tractor and a strap came up from the maintenance shop. That took 19 minutes. She was awake the whole time, and twice she asked about the urn. which was still in the hands of the man carrying it. Her injuries were fractures of the pelvis and thigh. She was operated on that night and again 2 days later. She spent 3 weeks in hospital and never stood up again. The hospital recorded a blood clot in the lung. She died on the 22nd day. The stone she had touched had not belonged to anyone since 1938. That fact took the Cemetery Association's lawyer 4 months to establish, and it explains everything that followed. The plot had been sold in perpetuity in 1891. The last member of that family was buried under that stone in 1938. Perpetual care, as written into the deed, covered grass, roads, and fences. It said nothing about monuments because monuments were never the cemetery's property. A monument belongs to the plot owner, and on the owner's death, it passes to the heirs. There were no heirs anyone could trace, so before it fell, the association had no legal right to touch that stone and no legal duty to. No state in the country requires cemetery monuments to be inspected. After she died, the association hired a monument mason and paid him to walk the old section. He spent 6 days going row by row with a level in both hands, leaning on things. 206 stones moved under him. Not one of those had fallen. All of them moved. There was no money to reset them, no owner to bill for the work, and no authority to haul them away. Laying them down on the grass was the only option that existed. 40 yards downhill, in the newest part of the same cemetery, the rules allow only bronze markers set flush into concrete pads. That rule was written in 1968 to make the mowing faster. Nothing has ever fallen over there, and nothing ever will. Families came into the Kingsley office all that winter to ask why their grandparents' stones were lying in the grass. The answer was the same every time. Bring a document showing who owns the stone, and it goes back up. In the 20 years since, nobody has brought one. Nobody has counted how many dry-set monuments stand in the old sections of cemeteries elsewhere. No law requires anyone to count them. No law says who would pay if anyone did. Kingsley answered the question the only way it could, and 206 families have been angry about it ever since.
5.
The crypt had not been opened in 26 years, and on the morning it finally was, the iron door stood ajar for a full hour before the first man went down the steps. Everyone agreed on that hour afterward because it was the reason nobody hesitated. The crypt belonged to a family that had been burying its dead in a city cemetery in Ohio since 1912. It was brick, built into a hillside, with a short flight of stone steps leading down from an iron door to a chamber below ground. The steps were the whole problem, though nobody alive had reason to know that yet. That morning, it was being opened for the interment of a woman of 91. Hers would be the first burial inside it in 26 years, and the shelves held 8 of her family already. The funeral director had run more than 1,000 services. He stood at the top of the steps with the paperwork, and the family waited on the path behind him. Nobody in that group knew the one thing that mattered. A sealed chamber full of old burials makes gas. Decades of slow decay in closed coffins produce several gases, and among them is hydrogen sulfide. It is heavier than air. In a room below ground, it does not drift out through an open door, because the door stands above it. It fills the chamber from the floor upward and sits there like water in a basin, and an hour of open door takes off nothing but the surface. It has one more property, and the property is the trap. In small amounts, it reeks of rotten eggs, a smell nobody ignores. Past a certain concentration, it switches off the sense of smell within seconds. The stronger it gets, the cleaner the air seems. The cemetery did have a written procedure for opening crypts. Open at first light, let the space air out, enter after an hour. The procedure had been written for the cemetery's mausoleums, which stand entirely above ground, where wind moves through in minutes. Applied to a chamber below grade, the same hour measured nothing except everyone's patience. When the men opened the door at 8, the smell from the doorway was strong enough that they stepped back and made jokes about it. By 9, the doorway smelled of nothing at all. The men drank their coffee 10 feet from it. To every person standing there, that was the procedure working. The younger groundsman went down first, carrying a folding stand for the casket. The director watched him take 4 steps down into the shade, reach the floor, and sit. That is what it looked like from above. He sat, and then he lay over sideways, without a sound, the stand still in his hand. The director shouted his name. The second groundsman was moving before anyone could think, down the same 4 steps, shouting back that the air was fine, that there was no smell. He reached his workmate, took him under the arms, dragged him 1 step, and folded down across him. From the top of the stairs, it looked like fainting, twice, in a place where nothing at all was happening. The third worker started for the steps at a run. The director caught him by the collar with both hands and did not let go. The 2 of them stood locked at the top of the stairs, shouting past each other, while a mourner on the path called the fire department. Holding that collar was the only physical act the director performed all morning. It is the reason 2 men died at that crypt instead of 3. The engine company arrived in 8 minutes, which felt to the people on the path like a season of the year. Their gas meter began shrieking at the doorway before the first firefighter reached the 3rd step, and the crew went down on bottled air. The younger groundsman was beyond help at the scene. The gas had stopped his breathing within a minute of his reaching the floor, and he had never known it was there. The second man was carried up conscious, talking, apologizing for the trouble. The gas had already burned the lining of his lungs, and through that night, the damaged tissue slowly filled with fluid. He died in the hospital on the 4th day. The family had watched all of it from the path, standing beside the casket of the woman they had come to bury. The interment never happened. The cemetery resealed the iron door that winter and bricked over it in the spring, with 9 spaces still empty inside. The procedure was rewritten within the month, and it is 2 lines long. No employee enters any below-ground chamber for any reason without a gas meter reading taken at the floor, not the doorway. The meter cost less than a day's wages, and one had been sitting for years in the maintenance shop of the water utility across the road. The woman of 91 was buried in a ground plot her family bought that same week, an arm's length from the crypt wall. Her name is the last one, carved on the monument above a door that will never open again. The grass over her grave grows against the brick of the chamber she was meant to lie inside.
6.
The logbook of St. Andrew's Tower runs back 61 years, and every page of it is filled in but 1 square. The church stands in a village in the west of England, and its 6 bells are hung for full circle ringing in the English way. A bell hung that way can rest in one of 2 positions, and everything that follows turns on the difference between them. Down, it hangs with its mouth toward the floor, the way anyone would picture a bell. A pull on the rope rocks it gently and chimes it, and a child can do that in perfect safety. Up is different. To ring properly, ringers first swing the bell higher and higher. In the end, it goes all the way over and comes to rest, balanced with its mouth toward the sky. Ringers call this standing the bell, and a band leaves bells up between 2 close pieces of ringing to save raising them again. A bell standing up is not resting. It is a mass of 3/4 of a ton, balanced on the very point of falling. The only thing holding it there is a wooden stay about the size of a chair leg. The next pull on that rope does not chime the bell. It brings the whole weight over and through a full turn. The rope first drops slack, then is snatched upward through the small hole in the ceiling faster than a hand can open. From the ringing room below, none of this can be seen. The bell hangs in the chamber overhead, behind closed boards. A ringer can read the difference from the way the rope hangs. To anyone who has never rung, the 2 look the same. For a visitor, the only witnesses are the log and the habit that keeps it. The habit at St. Andrew's, written into the Tower Rules in 1963, was simple. The last band of the evening rings every bell down. Then the person who locks the door ticks a square in the log that says all 6 bells are down. For 61 years the habit had held, evening after evening, hand after hand. On the Thursday before the funeral, practice ran late. 7 ringers came, 2 of them learners, and the evening ended in the ordinary shuffle of coats and good nights. The entry for that practice is in the book in a neat hand with the date and the names. The square beside it, the one that says all bells down, is empty. On Saturday, the church buried a man of 79 who had lived in the village all his life. His family asked for the old custom, 1 slow stroke of the tenor for every year, and they asked that his nephew be the one to sound them. The vicar agreed without a thought, because tolling a bell that is down is genuinely safe, and the tenor was always left down. The nephew was 34, a quiet man who had driven up from the city the night before. He had never touched a bell rope in his life. Before the coffin arrived, he stood alone in the ringing room with the verger's instructions in his head. Pull gently, count aloud, leave a breath between strokes. To keep his grip through 79 pulls, he wound the tail of the rope once around his wrist. It is the most natural act in the world, and every ringer in the country is taught on their first evening never to do it. The church above him was filling. He could hear the organ through the wall and shoes on the stone. Then he pulled gently, expecting the small resistance of a hanging bell. The tenor was up. It had been up since Thursday. The stay let the bell pass the balance, the full weight came over and through, and the rope he was wound to went up through the ceiling hole. He was taken off his feet, carried up, and struck against the beam beside the hole. Then the rope paid back down, and he fell to the boards. The verger found him within the minute, because the sound itself was wrong. 1 deep blow of the tenor, far too loud for tolling, and then nothing at all. His injuries were not survivable, and death was immediate. The inquest sat for 2 days and heard 7 honest, careful, contradictory memories. Each ringer was certain the tenor had been rung down. Each assumed the tick would be made by whoever locked up. The one who locked up believed the square was the tower captain's job. The captain had left 10 minutes early that night for reasons nobody thought to write down. The coroner recorded that no individual act could be identified, only the absence of one. The diocese acted within the season. Every tower in it now keeps a painted board by the door, turned by hand to read bells up or bells down, visible before anyone touches a rope. No visitor sounds a bell without a trained ringer standing beside them. The rule cost a piece of plywood per tower. 7 ringers gave evidence at the inquest, and 7 of them left the courtroom, believing a different person should have made that tick. Nobody ever learned whose hand it should have been, and after 2 days of asking, the court accepted that nobody ever would. In every case here, the fix already existed. A cart, a meter, a tick in a logbook, a 15-minute pause. What was missing was a person with the standing to demand it. So settle this in the comments. At a funeral, whose word should outrank grief? The professional who knows the risk or the family living the day? Argue it out below, and if this one held you, leave a like and subscribe.